He says sea level rise, it's inevitable. Work with it. Don't fight it. You can't fight it. That's the danger. Like we say, climate change is going to end the world. Sea level rise is going to take over all the cities. Saltwater intrusion. We won't be able to eat rice anymore. We can't fight that. And if we have that mentality dictates the construction of bigger walls and bigger dams and bigger divisions. That requires a mentality of separating ourselves from natural processes, separating our community from other communities, separating our country from other countries, right? And that is not transboundary.
As you know, I have a very clear mission with building green. And I know so many brilliant architects, interior designers, and contractors who do too. But they're still stuck working on projects that drain them, with clients who don't value what they bring. That's why we founded Market Your Architecture over a year ago. It's a marketing agency that helps mission-driven designers attract better clients, charge what they are worth, and finally build the kind of portfolio that reflects who they really are. If that sounds like the shift you need, there's a link in the description to marketyourarchitecture.com. And before we jump into the podcast, please rate and subscribe. It really helps me reach more people like you. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. When you think of rivers, you probably don't think of architects. But Derek Hoeferlin has made it his life's work to prove why you should. As an architect, chair of landscape architecture, and author of Way Beyond Bigness, Derek advocates for a radical shift in how we design with water and not against it. He studied watersheds across the Mississippi, Mekong, and Rhine, learning how infrastructure, culture, and community intersect. Whether it's rethinking the 20th century concrete-heavy mindset or collaborating with Mekong farmers growing salt-tolerant crops as a response to rising sea levels, Derek shows that every river tells a story of both conflict and connection. Let's dive in. So, Derek, you have spent your career studying watersheds around the world, in Mississippi, Mekong, at the Rhine. But if we zoom out for a second, what is one thing about water that most people completely misunderstand?
I don't know if it's about misunderstanding, but I think we take it for granted. We assume that we will have access to it. We assume that it's clean and plentiful. And I think we also tend to, with taking it for granted, we tend to misuse it, I would say. So I think that's kind of a misunderstanding, is maybe the misuse of water.
What do you mean by misusing it?
That we don't realize that maybe it's a shared resource, that we have to be really thoughtful and understand that there's different ways of using it. People have different access to it, and we tend to treat it as something that is our own thing to use and not actually share.
That makes sense. So you came up with the term watershed architecture. Can you walk me through what that actually means and why it matters now more than ever?
Right. So watershed architecture, that evolved over a number of years. And it's, so obviously I'm trained as an architect. That's what I went to school for. That's what I'm legally responsible to do. I am the chair of landscape architecture here at my school, so I'm very interested in landscape architecture. So there are different disciplines that use the word architecture. The most classic one, obviously, is architecture itself and architects. Then the discipline of landscape architecture, which is much more specific on landscape, but also as a professional discipline, at least here in the United States. But over time, that word architecture, and I talk about this in my research in my book, has come to encompass basically anything. I mean, it could be the design of something, is the way Oxford Dictionary actually has an alternate definition for architecture. So it's broadened and broadened and broadened in this much more complicated, complex world. You could be a IT or software architect, or you could be an architect of something very dangerous. We see that in the news cycle. So I started to say, well, if I'm really focusing on water as a core issue in the fields of design, whether that's architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, or design more broadly, maybe we need to tie the word watershed to architecture. So I'm not advocating for a new discipline or a new design discipline, but I'm asking for a new way of holistically thinking about water, and more broadly, their watersheds in relation to architecture, and more broadly, the built environment that we all share. So one classic definition of watershed is like where rivers and streams draining eventually down into a sea or an ocean. But there's an alternate definition of watershed, which is not about water, but it's about like tipping points or changes of history or events, like a watershed moment, as we refer to it. And that may not translate from English to other languages, but it's the idea that when something happens drastically, or an event that can change kind of how we move forward. So it's thinking about watersheds in terms of water and all the land and water that we share within a watershed, but also real complex socio-political, geographical events that we need to also address.
So interesting. So you're not just an architect, you're bridging different disciplines from public health to social work. What's wrong about how we're currently approaching watersheds?
I don't know if it's what's wrong about it. I mean, like, it is. There are real challenges. And I think it's less about what's being wrong. It's more about maybe wrestling with new contemporary events that have become much more intense, which is a political hot potato now, is climate change, for instance, right? So in the past, maybe there was interdisciplinary work. Architects and designers were working very collaboratively with social workers or engineers, but it was in a different kind of mindset, even more so a 20th century mindset of development, of infrastructure, massive infrastructural development. Populations were starting to rapidly increase. And now in this century, for many complicated reasons, I think we need to rethink those interdisciplinary models of collaboration. So, architects and landscape architects and designers, when they're working at their greatest throughout history, they've been very collaborative. I mean, we work with consultants, and an architect is not the author of everything. They have to have this team to work with. But I think the rules of the game have changed, and we need new models of that type of collaborative work, at least in relation to water-based challenges.
Where do you see the biggest potential or the biggest challenges?
The biggest potential is, rethinking the 20th century systems, moving forward. I mean, here close to home in the Mississippi, we're coming up on, and I'll speak very kind of detailed about an event, but we're coming up on a 100-year anniversary of the Great Flood of 1927, which honestly, even in the United States, not many people remember that in their history or are taught that in the history, but it was a massive flood event in the lower portion of the Mississippi watershed. And the result of that was something called the Flood Control Act of 1928 that basically redesigned the whole infrastructure of the middle part of the country and the United States at large, and arguably globally. So this event, a catastrophe, kind of created a new, completely engineered system. And that's what I mean by a 20th century system. It's a very engineered way of controlling the river. And it had many great outcomes, let's be clear, especially economically for the United States. But with that came unintended consequences, environmental degradation, ecological challenges. They were also happening during very racial challenging times in the United States. But I think moving forward, we have an opportunity with, for instance, this 100-year anniversary to think not necessarily the next 100 years, but maybe in a much more ecological, sustainable way of what, the development here in the Mississippi could be, for instance. So I think that's the potential. And that's, as an architect, I'm an optimist. I write about this. We believe that these things could happen. We speculate on the future. We design. We try to smile. We try not to always wear black, maybe. But the challenges are deep, and there's no getting around the geopolitical issues that are happening every minute right now. And so how we navigate consensus building and shared ethos of what's going to be our planet for our children and our grandchildren, or our other species, is the real what we call Gordian knot. It's a wicked problem. It's an impossible problem, but we have to come to terms with it.
And if we look at the next 100 years, or planning for the next 100 years, what are like 3 things that would be non-negotiable for you?
One, I think we need to advocate for design. I think that needs to be part of the conversation. 2, we can't pass this on to the other generations below us. And again, that's very complicated in the United States right now. And 3, I would argue for a new kind of jurisdictional, multidisciplinary, design-based system for infrastructure. That's very vague, but it's complicated. I don't want to say in any way that we don't have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers moving forward, because they're amazing in many different ways. But I really think we need a different kind of structure for these over the future.
How has it been done in the past? Just by engineers?
That's overly simplistically. In the Mississippi, at least, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been responsible, at least for the larger scale projects. They're responsible for managing, constructing, implementing systems of navigation, flood control, and a whole other litany of projects, at least along the rivers and their tributaries. The mandate and the kind of directives to the Corps of Engineers come from U.S. Congress. So they're all so all that comes through a very kind of political, governmental process, top-down process for that. But that's at the federal level. But then in the local and state levels, things are operated at that level too. So that's kind of the historical system, and it's a very bureaucratic one. Things take a long time to happen, and the like.
And so you've worked on watersheds across different continents. What's one lesson from one specific region that could completely change how another handles water?
For me, just being able to go visit these places, and I've been very fortunate to do it since I teach here at Washington University. I've had support to do it. I love traveling. I've always loved traveling. So the first step is just going, making sure you're there and engaged, that you go visit the places and not just do it obviously as a tourist or let alone a researcher, but start to build up relationships and networks when you're there. So that's the most beautiful part of it. So in the Mekong in Southeast Asia, and then up towards Yunnan province in Southwest China, over the last 20 years, I've made trips and repetitive trips to go visit different colleagues or researchers that are doing really incredible on the ground work with communities, or so much more kind of site scale, neighborhood scale, community engaged scale work. And that's happened. I've been able to build that network through my academic network, but also going to like different conferences. So interestingly enough, I went to a conference in Rotterdam back in 2010. So in more or less the Rhine river basin, Rhine watershed. That was a conference called Deltas in the Times of Climate Change. It was one of these early on conferences that was talking about climate change in deltas. So that was 15 years ago. And I met just randomly at a coffee break. I went to a presentation by a agricultural scientist from the Mekong Delta, Dr. Duong Van Ni. And I was fascinated by his presentation because he's helping farmers that are typically working with freshwater crops like rice and helping them transfer to more salt-tolerant crops because of things like subsidence and sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. So I went and had coffee with him, and he said, please come visit, come to the Mekong Delta. So I made that connection in the Rhine, via me coming and talking about the Mississippi. And then I went to the Mekong and met up with him, and he helped guide me for 5 days around the whole Mekong Delta, which is just spectacular. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but just the first step is what I talk about in my book as well. You just don't go and analyze, you appreciate. You have to appreciate what's happening. And then by going to each one of these river basins and looking at them kind of in a very focused way in terms of how they've been transformed infrastructurally, primarily through locks and dams and levees. Interestingly enough, all three of them, although they're very different in scale, very different in size, very different in climate, very different in culture, politics. I mean, the three of them couldn't be more different, honestly. Even though the Rhine and the Mississippi might share some kind of European, Eurocentric ways of doing things over history, they're still very different. And the Mekong is obviously very different. However, they've all basically been designed, redesigned, or are being designed in very similar ways in terms of infrastructure. They all build big dams. They all have locks for navigation. They all have levees for flood protection. So it's kind of strangely generic how they're all designed, but then the culture and everything else is very specific and different amongst them. So then how do you understand that kind of, how do you negotiate that complexity? And they're all at very different states. So the Mississippi, like I said, is very much a 20th century, very innovative way of reconstructing the whole watershed for infrastructure. The Rhine, much more older, historic, but is arguably adapting, changing in terms of climate change maybe, or dam removals and things like that. And then the Mekong is just starting everything almost from scratch. The last 20 years, in terms of massive dam construction, especially in the upper basin and China and Laos. So they're doing very similar things that we did in the 20th century, which is interesting. But it's also very dangerous, and I'll stop here. It's very dangerous for someone like me or a Westerner to go to the Mekong and say, don't make the mistakes we made, right? Don't build the same way. Don't do what we did. And because they would be like, why can't we build that? Because we want to develop as well, right? So it's a tricky conversation to have in terms of being overly critical or understanding why certain things are happening in certain places around the world.
So if we go back a step, for those listeners who've never really researched watersheds and dams, how do they work?
Well, the classic definition of watersheds, and I don't know it by memory, I referred to it a little bit, but is an area of land with its rivers and streams that all drain down to a body of water. So your background is the Alps with the snow. That's where it all starts. You can't go much higher than that on the land. It obviously comes from the water cycle in the sky. So water evaporates from the ocean. It's salt. It goes up into the sky. It becomes fresh. It drops to the mountains, and then it goes down through tributaries to the main stem. So the Mississippi is the main stem. The Mekong is the main stem. The Rhine is the main stem of their watersheds. And then that all eventually drains by physics and all those good things and gravity to sea level. The water, as it gets towards sea level, when it gets to a delta, it starts to slow up because it's trying to figure out how to manage itself and get to that. And when it does that, it usually distributes and creates deltas. So it goes from tributaries, contribute water to a main stem, and then when it gets down to the delta, it distributes the water. So it does the reverse, and then it makes it to, the North Sea or the South China Sea or the Gulf of Mexico, now renamed the Gulf of America. And that's how the watershed works. That's in the natural sense. That's the hydrologic cycle. Now, another way to think about it is hydraulically. So there's hydrologic and then there's hydraulic, and not necessarily that dams and levees are hydraulic, but hydraulic deals with like pumping water. So doing the reverse. So it's taking water that's going like this, it's grabbing it and maybe pumping it up and reversing the natural cycle. And then by pumping it, you can move it and redirect it to a community, to a development. You can move it around really fast and create turbines and energy. And that's what a lot of dams are for. They create hydropower. Again, Switzerland and places like that, massive amounts of hydropower because you've got so much water coming from the snowmelt. Those dams are also used to create reservoirs behind them. And those reservoirs are used for that power generation during, for instance, dry times, because you don't have as much water. You have that water stored, and then you can move it through and generate energy. Or it's used for irrigation. A lot of these big dams are used to create giant reservoirs and less water resourced areas for agriculture. And then it's a very managed way of knowing you always have access to water. And then flood control. These dams sometimes hold the water to stop water from going downriver and flooding communities or other places like that. But the main so saying all that, which is the more kind of obvious reasons for dams, so power generation, flood control, and irrigation, also water quality for certain things. The main reason for locks and dams, and the main kind of directive of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is navigation. So that's the real thing. So for instance, the locks that are in the upper Rhine, from like Strasbourg up to Basel, all those locks, and dams, those are to be able to make sure that the ships can get through. All the locks in the upper Mississippi from Minneapolis, St. Paul to St. Louis, there's 27 of them. They have to maintain they're used to maintain a draft depth for barges to be able to get through. So they have to go through and they drop down, they go through, they drop down. Otherwise, they can't navigate the river. And that's the primary charge for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is navigation. That's number one. Flood control is after that. Most people think their primary charge is flood control, meaning protecting communities. Actually, you have to maintain the navigation channel to get the barges up and down the river, to be able to get all the agriculture down to ship around the world, and to be able to get all the things like fertilizer upriver for the crops. So it's a very interesting intertwined network, but that's really, and I mean, long answer maybe to your question. That's what watersheds are, and then that's how the infrastructure uses the watersheds as a resource to then control them for, in very good ways, economic benefit and protection of communities.
Do you know how old the oldest watersheds are?
Like the dawn of the earth?
Those who are built by humans.
Oh, you mean like the ones that have been transformed? I don't know. I mean, that's a complicated question. Where I think I would assume one of the first things that was done way back when, humans probably were carefully observing other species. Like, I don't know how long beavers have been around, but beavers make dams, right? And do it very sustainably. And so I think probably very quickly, humans knew they needed to manage or control water, right? And some civilizations did that much more responsibly probably than others.
So you mentioned the sustainable aspect of it. From a sustainability perspective, I mean, oftentimes dams are huge concrete walls. Mm-hmm. And from a sustainability perspective, does the use justify that huge construction? There's not
a right or wrong answer to that. I want to be clear, like in my book and in my research, I'm not on the extreme view of what's de-damming the world, like taking every single dam down. I think we have probably too many dams. And a lot of that actually has to do with maintenance and operation, and that they're not there aren't the resources to take care of them. And that's dangerous because the last thing you want is for a dam or a levee to fail, right? So I think probably less construction and more removal is probably the better. But everything has trade-offs, right? So for instance, hydropower, I guess technically is a sustainable energy source. It's kind of put in the bucket. It's not talked about as much, maybe because it's used already so much, but it's it's put in with like solar and wind and other things. But as you said, to generate hydropower, unlike the beavers would with wood or old like wooden stick dams that would be in places like in the Rhine or Switzerland, for instance, the older ones, you need a lot of concrete. So obviously, as we all know, concrete is one of the largest carbon emitters, in terms of construction. So that doesn't help greenhouse gas emissions and things like that. But also another byproduct of dams and reservoirs is a high amount of methane emissions. And I'm not an expert on this, but with those reservoirs, they create methane going up into the air. And also, as we know, methane is, if not more so, a carbon emitter. So there's a lot. It's all trade-offs. I just think one of the most important thing to realize and to engage with is how we move forward, not just moving forward, but how we engage the communities that are negatively impacted by dam construction that have gone to benefit other communities instead. So those are usually ones like, at least in the United States, those are usually indigenous communities or native communities that were there long before we ever came, long before the dams were constructed. And so that's I think the cultural fallout and the imbalance between the haves and have-nots as a result of large-scale infrastructure is important.
Just a quick reality check. If you're constantly over-delivering, working around the clock, and still chasing the right kind of projects, you're not alone. I keep meeting architects, interior designers, and contractors in that exact cycle, which is actually why we started Market Your Architecture. We help you reposition your work and get in front of more of the right people, so you can finally choose who you want to work with. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to know more about us, you'll find the link to marketyourarchitecture.com in the description.
Do you know how deep of a conversation that is currently, the sustainable justification? Because, for example, I was in Panama a few months ago, and they have the Panama Canal there, which is also some kind of dam. And in that case, I think, or I guess it is more sustainable. I don't know the data about it, but it is a way shorter way for the boats to go through across the Panama Canal instead of around the whole continent. And the way they built it was without making a huge hole, let's say, through the country and making a huge river, but working with what you explained earlier, pushing the ships up and down.
Right.
So in that case, I see the sustainable justification. If it's power production, I don't know how much more power we can produce in a sustainable way. But do you know if the conversation has shifted to a more conscious one?
Yes, it has. And this is where I'm optimistic and hopeful. I mean, I'm going to be part of a conference next week here in St. Louis that is mostly civil engineers. I was at one a couple of weeks ago. So usually I'm the only architect or wild card, weirdo designer in there talking about other abstract things. But there is a huge push within, like, for instance, the engineering community. There's this new conversation called, nature-based solutions is something that's a new kind of buzzword. The Corps of Engineers has a new program called Engineering with Nature. It's an interesting way to talk about nature, but it's instead of building more gray infrastructure in the future, it's building more, for instance, space for the river, more wetland reconstruction. more interspecies conversations. The benefits of wetlands are not just flood control and sponges for ecology, but they also create, other opportunities for ducks, for instance. And in the Mississippi, especially where I'm from, people love ducks because they can go hunt too. So some of these projects are being funded in great ways by Ducks Unlimited, which is an organization, a non-governmental organization, a private organization that's helping collaborate with the Corps of Engineers to restore wetlands. So it's somewhat ironic, like where is the money coming from? Where are the interests coming from? But it's mutual benefit. So the conversation is definitely tilted and switched in different directions. Funding wise, that's a whole other question. Like how much of that conversation gets X amount of money, whereas is there still 80 or 90% going into the 20th century way. And some of that has to do with just maintenance. We have this system, we have to maintain it, and you can't just blow the whole thing up, metaphorically, and start from scratch. So it's how do you adapt these systems?
And if we look at the very, very large scale of how these dams or watersheds work together, what's the more surprising thing you found out in your research of how they work together on a large scale?
Well, that goes back to, when I first started it, first started to work, where I was doing so much work in New Orleans, Louisiana. So that was after, and this is more kind of the personal aspect of why I came to the work. But I was working with amazing people. I used to live there. I left before the big Hurricane Katrina hit, which this is the 20-year anniversary of it, which sounds crazy that it was already 20 years ago. And we were doing all this very important work in the Delta, not just in the city, but very quickly looking at the whole coast. And I talked about the way the Delta and the wetlands is this important system where the Mississippi spreads out. And there's all these really wicked challenges of how it's not doing what it once did in a very dynamic and natural way. So the talk and the work, very importantly, was about the Delta and the Delta urbanism of New Orleans. And that was in collaboration with a lot of colleagues from the Netherlands at the time. So people like Han Meyer, who coined the term Delta urbanism, taught it to U Delft. So we started that collaborative work there. And it was a lessons learned about how can we share knowledge between New Orleans and the Louisiana Delta with, the Netherlands and Holland and the Rhine, Maas Delta and all that. But since I was from St. Louis, I kept going back to St. Louis. I would fly back and forth, or drive or whatever. And I'd come back to St. Louis and I'd be witnessing much more extreme weather events happening here, more floods more frequently, more droughts more frequently, our lack of connection to our river because of all this infrastructure and navigation. Very few moments you can go and actually publicly engage with the river. You have to drive out further to engage the environment and the ecology. And I started to then think about, well, where are a lot of these issues coming from that are negatively impacting the Delta? And they're happening far upstream. So one of the main reasons why the South Louisiana and the wetlands are eroding is because they're not receiving the sediment from the river that used to naturally flood and then deposit that sediment and help grow the wetlands and, counteract the effects of sea level rise. Because a lot of that, or the majority of that sediment, is trapped now behind dams thousands of miles upriver. So along the Missouri River, there are 6 massive dams. There are several more, but there are 6 big ones that have these huge reservoirs for all the reasons I talked about earlier, navigation a bit, but flood control, irrigation, hydropower. But the unintended consequence of that is that it's trapped the sediment in the water column, and it doesn't let all of it go down eventually to the Gulf, to the Delta by the Gulf. And that happens all throughout the Mississippi in different ways. Agricultural runoff creates huge nutrient load that goes into the Mississippi River and funnels its way down because of all these levees and then out to the Gulf to create the dead zone. And it creates this kind of space where fish can't live. So that's where I'm like, wait a minute, if we're going to really talk about coastal challenges, sea level rise, urbanisms along those areas like New Orleans, San Francisco, New York, Rotterdam, Shanghai, London, all these places, you have to zoom back out. And then that's where you get a lot of pushback, because you're like, that people are like, that's too complicated. It's too big. You can't get all these people together to talk about these giant scales. And maybe people are right about that. But my answer is we have to try, we have to find alternate models, or else we're not going to change the system ever. So that's how your question about the bigger scale of the watershed, hence the title Way Beyond Bigness. I'm actually trying to say, well, let's move beyond that big scale and think very differently. Like, let's not even think about the massive scale. Maybe start to think much smaller scale, but understand that much smaller scale, the community, our intimate relationship with water within the context of the entire watershed. So always thinking about that relationship, I think, is super important.
Yeah, that's where also the architects and all the other industries come together, right?
Right.
Yeah. What's one example of a very small scale design intervention that had a massive impact?
In a humble way, I think going back to someone like the agricultural scientist I mentioned in the Mekong Delta, Dr. Ni, I don't know if it's had a big impact yet, but I think it could and it will. And it's happening right now. And my most recent visit to the Delta back a few months ago, I went and visited with this local kind of like microeconomy community like shop, where they're helping a network of farmers like within a few mile radius, so not too big, that are already have an established strong community, that are all historically rice farmers. And they're slowly working with different families to dedicate part of their rice farms to growing, as I said, more salt-tolerant crops like bulrush, for instance. So it's this amazing reed that can grow pretty well in a brackish condition, meaning in between salt and in between fresh. Other types of crops that are salt-tolerant. But they're not just doing that. They're not just growing it, then they're harvesting it. And then the members of the families and the network then are using the bulrush to create textiles like baskets and weavings. And then they're beautiful. And then they're selling them, like not just within their community, but they're also working and negotiating with people like Walmart, like transnational corporations, to sell this harvested textile from something that's negatively thought about, like sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. So I think that's a beautiful example of adaptation, because what Dr. Ni is doing, most importantly, is working with the local community. But he's also very pragmatic about it. He doesn't, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he says sea level rise, it's inevitable. Kind of like, just work with it. Don't fight it. You can't fight it, right? And that's the danger. Like we say, climate change is going to end the world. Sea level rise is going to take over all the cities. Saltwater intrusion, we won't be able to eat rice anymore. No, we can't fight that. And if we have that mentality, that mentality dictates the construction of bigger walls and bigger dams and bigger divisions. That requires a mentality of separating ourselves from natural processes, separating our community from other communities, separating our country from other countries, right? And that is not transboundary. That's siloed. That's its own thing. So that's where I think what he's doing in a very small way is kind of knowing that there are other challenges happening far upriver or coming from the sea, but we're trying to still exist in our community and adapt to those challenges. So they're not fixing the dams far upriver. They're not fixing all the increased temperature that's making the sea level rise, but they're adapting within those two extremes.
So not working against the climate, but with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I answered your question with a very non-typical kind of design project. it's not like an architect or landscape architect designed it. So that's somewhat ironic because I'm advocating for designers to say, because there are a lot of great landscape architecture and urban projects, riverfront projects. The Room for the River program in the Netherlands is amazing, right? Like it did its networked series of projects, in the last 25 years. And we can all go visit them. I visited them and they're incredible. So that's another example, the Room for the River program. But I think the fact that me as an architect has sought out other disciplines that are actually doing design-based projects because they're working with the built environment in a very sustainable way. So then the question it begs, how can we as design disciplines become part of that? Because we have so much then we can add to that, right? We have other ways of, graphically narrating stories or talking about hybrid multi-use projects, for instance. Like how does that bulrush farm then connect to the school that's right next door to a public park, right? Then that becomes a really interesting kind of project because it's not just one thing anymore, but it's 5 different things that are all designed together.
For those who are not familiar with the Room for the River program, can you break it down?
Yeah, and I haven't. I mean, we talk about it in the book, and I would, the first reference I would say is just Google search Room for the River program because I'll probably get a lot of things wrong. But a lot of, and hence why there was such a strong connection between the Netherlands and the Dutch with New Orleans after Katrina was that shared kind of catastrophes happened. Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, unfortunately killed about 2,000 people because it was a catastrophic failure of infrastructure. The Great Flood, or whatever it was called, of 1953 in Holland, unfortunately killed about 2,000 people as well, and was massive, failures in terms of the infrastructure, and that created their, start of the new, redesign of their whole country in terms of flood control. But once Katrina hit, they realized they needed to rethink that whole system because of new parameters like climate change needed to adapt. So the old Delta Works project then phased into, so the Delta Works project was this massive construction of storm surge barriers, levees, construction over decades of time. And then they finished that project. And then they started the Room for the River program. So I don't know exactly when the date was, but I think it officially ended a few years ago. And it's a series. What's beautiful about it is that it's a series of networked projects across the whole country. So it's not just a one-off. It's not like you just do one project and make more space for flooding or use that space to manage drought as well and groundwater. They all interact with each other. So downriver, one might be doing something, whereas upriver, another one might be doing something else. And that was policy driven. That's, the Dutch government, because the majority of the country obviously is at risk for, being at or below sea level. And in a really good way, most of those projects are integrated. They combine public use, recreation, housing, commercial, new infrastructure with flood control. And that's something that's very difficult to do in the United States because we don't have those funding mechanisms that really incentivizes multi-use bundled development. Like we build a levee over here and that's all you can build. You build a school over here and that's all you can build. But that levee is supposed to protect that school, whereas in the Netherlands, you might have a levee school, and they might be together, right? Because it's so much more dense, right? Everything is so packed in the Netherlands and of course in Switzerland and Europe. So you're kind of forced to come up against each other and negotiate. Whereas in the United States, in the Mississippi watershed especially, there's so much space we can easily segregate things and keep things separate from each other. So that's just kind of how the system works.
Do you think that's one of the points in the systems that need more work on for the future? To make sure people work together and things work together instead of separately?
Yes, yeah, and that goes back to the interdisciplinary question, the transboundary question, or transdisciplinary. We have all these different words for multidisciplinary. Yes, I think less working in silos and more integrated. And then I talk about it in my research that we need more hybrid mechanisms. And that's a bit kind of maybe obtuse as an idea, but hybridity, where you just don't have something working over here and something working over here, but they need to negotiate and work together. And that stems out of a theorist that I write about that researches water, that talks about almost all water-based conversations are inherently about conflict. Like whenever you talk about water, and this goes back to the beginning of your questions, why water, why watersheds? Usually it has something to do with different interests. It doesn't mean conflict like a war. It could be. I mean, we do have water wars. We know that. Like water access has literally created wars. We have them going on now in the world that you probably could say are directly related to water. But it's also just about conflict in terms of different points of view of how you use the water or who's the water for. And so the way to manage conflict is, I would think designers and architects are good at being part of that conversation because that's kind of what we're trained to do. But it's also to come up with hybrid mechanisms, right? Instead of like single ways of doing things, you need ones that have multiple points of view, multiple facets, and things like that.
Can you give some examples of hybrid mechanisms?
Well, so like I referred to in the, totally going to a different part of the world, like in Tokyo. Tokyo is a huge risk for flooding, right? And so they have like their developments, like they'll have like a mega dam. Like you won't even know that you're on a levee, but like that's a whole city, right? You're like, the roads are on it, the buildings are on it, and it's, it might slightly slope up a little bit, but that's a physical hybrid. I mean, it's a big project, but that's where everything is integrated. And that's pretty cool, So it's a way to kind of like think about cities that are very functional, very beautiful, very active, but also very protective. They're doing their job, right? So you're not just like walking down a street, which you would typically do in the United States. And at the end of that wall, like in New Orleans, or at the end of that street in New Orleans, you'll see a big wall or a levee. And there it is, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I think the water is on the other side of there, but I'm scared of it. I'm terrified because there's a wall in front of me, right? Whereas something like that in Tokyo, you eventually just walk and you're walking by all the shops and there's housing, and then you get out and then you can see the water, right? And it's all just connected, right? I think a lot of cities obviously have once turned their back on the river or re-engaging the river. It's very difficult in the Mississippi because the infrastructure is so huge. But places, we're trying here in St. Louis, but places upriver, smaller river towns, and even like small cities have done a really good job with it. Memphis, Tennessee has really stronger connections to the river. I was in Brisbane, Australia a few years ago for a conference after their big floods, because they've had huge floods, and their kind of attitude is, this is an opportunity to re-engage our river, right? To bring our city back to the front door. So even though there's a risk, but if we manage that risk and then we develop around that, we can have a much more beautiful city. And they're going to have the Olympics, right? So sometimes you need things like that to be able to kind of get that conversation going. Those are just a couple very different examples of hybrid mechanisms. The other one would be, back what I already referred to on a very different scale, is what Dr. Ni is doing in the Mekong Delta. Like that is a great example because it's economic, it's environmental, it's infrastructural, it's multi-scaled. I just think it's missing architects and landscape architects. That's it. If we can get added into that, it would be a beautiful example of hybridity.
Now, Derek, what's your mission with your book, The Way Beyond Bigness?
Other than selling it? No, I don't know. No, seriously, I think it's, it's interesting. This is my first book I've ever done. I hope it's my last book. I don't know if I want to go about doing this again. It's been a slow kind of release. Like we started with a couple events but I hope it just kind of sustains itself, right? It's going to have, like any book, have shelf life and all that. But as I keep, since it is such large scale things we're talking about, multiple disciplines, the more people that kind of get exposed to it over time. So this month, I'm been invited to speak to a bunch of civil engineers at 2 different conferences. So getting it to that audience, getting it back, revisiting the places that I've been, like being able to go back to the Mekong and hopefully soon the Rhine and reconnect with people there. So just building these new networks. So this is where it's complicated, because everyone always asks the question, when you do a book, who's the audience, right? And that's been a very challenging one for me, because in a kind of not very smart business savvy way, I say the audience is the whole world, right? And then it's like, wait, you can't say that, right? But the audience are people like you, right? That have a mission to talk about sustainability more broadly. Obviously, since I'm an academic, really the students, the next generation, hopefully they, latch onto this a bit. But I think the most important one is getting it out to people outside the design disciplines in the communities. So it's a hard book to sell that way, because it's and with a publisher that's a very design-based publisher. It's high quality, so it's marketed towards architects and landscape architects and students in that, or people like you. But hopefully it detours and goes into these other kind of tracks of publics.
And what's one idea from the book that people should really take away?
One idea from the book is to take a step back and maybe just, whether you agree with it or not, like, how can you engage this term of watershed in those 2 different definitions? So I mentioned the idea of literally understanding with water, but whereas in that, very challenging instances or events happen to us, what is your role in that? The other thing, because the book is in 3 parts, kind of a classic way there's an analysis part, which is the majority of it. So hopefully learn and take the time to learn about how each one of these 3 watersheds has been designed. But more importantly, to your question, how can we optimistically speculate about the future, but not just empty promises, like here are big ideas and then stop there. But the third part of the book is about collaboration. And how do we start to develop these new models? And then I just kind of tease it, because it's a small part and I needed to get the book published. But I show some examples that I've done, mostly with students here at WashU, but also communities in St. Louis, where we've developed like kind of unique, whimsical ways of talking about these subjects. So one was a design installation that I did where I built a scaled model of the Mississippi watershed that we had public events around, and you can move the pieces around. And it was pretty abstract, but it was like, wow, that's the Mississippi watershed. And it's like, I can touch the whole Missouri River, right? So it's immediate one-to-one relationship between you, the human, and the entire watershed through a model. And then talk about different points of view about what does a watershed mean to you, right? So instead of thinking about it abstractly and like, oh my gosh, I can't understand thousands of square miles, hundreds of thousands of square miles. Well, here's a model of it right in front of you, and it's talking about X, Y, and Z. What is your reaction to that? Or how do you see moving forward? Another project we did, we collaborated with a cement company, a cement mixing company on the Mississippi River, very industrial in St. Louis, and they gave us access to their barge. So for a day, we went out on the barge with my students. We made temporary installations. So these like art installations out on the barge that talked about the river and sustainability. And then I invited about, 10 or 12 different disciplines, everything from ecologists to engineers to lawyers to policy to artists to architects and landscape architects. And we had a panel discussion on a barge on the Mississippi River. So instead of having that conversation in a room like this or in a conference room or a symposium, you go out onto the river and you look at the barges going by you and you talk about your relationship to those barges. So that's, those types of venues that's a starting point, at least.
That's a beautiful ending, Derek. Thank you so much. So if our audience wants to buy your book or follow your work, where can they find you?
Well, they can find me. I mean, I don't know if you, Derek Hoeferlin, you can look up derekhoeferlin.com. But the book, Way Beyond Bigness, is on the publisher is Applied Research and Design Publishing. So you can get the book directly from their website. ORO Editions is the name of the main publisher, but Applied Research and Design. And it's currently having a 30% sale, a flash sale. So you can get a discount code, but it's available anywhere else online as well. So.
Okay, I'll add the links in the description.
Great.
Thank you very much, Derek. This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you. It was a really great conversation. I hope I was somewhat clear as mud, as they would say in the Mississippi River. So
thank you.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at LatinaShip. Thanks.